The year is 336 BCE, and a 20-year-old prince stands over his father's body, murdered by his own bodyguard during what should have been a celebration. Within 13 years, this young man will have marched his army across 3 continents, defeated empires that had stood for centuries, and carved out the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. His name was Alexander III of Macedon, but history would know him as Alexander the Great. How does a king barely out of his teenage years conquer everything from Greece to India? What drives a man to push his soldiers across deserts, over mountains, and through rivers swollen with monsoon rains, never satisfied with the territories already won? Alexander's conquest of the known world wasn't just about military brilliance, though he possessed that in abundance. It was about vision, ambition, propaganda, and an almost superhuman refusal to accept limits. This is the story of how one man's relentless drive reshaped civilization, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, and created a legacy that would influence empires for thousands of years. But it's also the story of the soldiers who followed him, the generals who served him, the enemies who resisted him, and the cities that rose and fell in his wake. Join us as we trace Alexander's incredible journey from the mountains of Macedonia to the plains of India, examining not just the battles he won, but the strategies, innovations, and sheer force of personality that made the impossible real. Chapter 1. The Making of a Conqueror. The mountain kingdom of Macedonia in 356 BCE is a rough, semi-barbaric place by Greek standards, dismissed by the sophisticated city-states to the south as barely civilized. Yet, in the royal palace at Pella, something extraordinary is taking shape. King Philip II has just received news that his wife Olympias has given birth to a son. On the same day, his general Parmenion has won a great victory, and his horse has triumphed at the Olympic Games. The omens, the priests declare, are auspicious beyond measure. The child is named Alexander, and from his earliest moments, he's groomed not just to rule, but to conquer. Alexander's childhood is unlike anything we might imagine for a prince today. His mother Olympias, a princess from the wild kingdom of Epirus, fills his head with tales of divine ancestry. Claiming descent from Achilles on her side and Heracles on Philip's, she performs mysterious religious rites, keeps snakes as sacred companions, and instills in her son a sense that he is destined for godhood itself. This is no mere motherly encouragement. Olympias genuinely believes her son is marked by the divine, and Alexander absorbs this conviction into his very bones. It will drive him to attempt feats that rational men would dismiss as impossible. But if Olympias shapes Alexander's spirit, his father Philip shapes his mind and body. Philip is himself one of history's great military innovators, the man who transforms Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into Greece's dominant power. He introduces the sarissa, a pike up to 18 feet long that will become the signature weapon of Macedonian warfare. He organizes his infantry into the famous phalanx formation, a dense block of soldiers whose overlapping shields and protruding spears create an almost impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. Philip trains his men relentlessly, forcing them to march 30 miles in a day carrying their own equipment, forging them into the finest fighting force Greece has ever seen. Young Alexander watches all of this, absorbs it, learns from it. At age 13, Alexander's formal education begins under the most famous philosopher in the Greek world, Aristotle. Philip spares no expense, rebuilding the sanctuary of the nymphs at Mysa as a school and inviting Aristotle to teach his son and a select group of noble companions. For 3 years, Alexander studies philosophy, medicine, science, and literature. He develops a lifelong love of Homer's Iliad, keeping a copy under his pillow alongside a dagger, identifying himself with his ancestor Achilles, the greatest warrior of myth. Aristotle teaches him to think strategically, to observe the natural world, to question and analyze. The philosopher instills in him a love of Greek culture that Alexander will later spread across Asia. But Aristotle also teaches him that Greeks are naturally superior to barbarians, that non-Greeks are slaves by nature. This is a lesson Alexander will eventually reject through his actions, if not his words. The young prince's character reveals itself early. When he's 10 years old, a horse trader brings a magnificent black stallion to Philip's court. The horse is wild, unmanageable, and Philip orders it taken away. But Alexander sees what others have missed. The horse is afraid of its own shadow. He asks his father for a chance to tame it, wagering his considerable allowance that he can succeed. Philip, amused, agrees. Alexander turns the horse to face the sun so it cannot see its shadow, speaks soothingly to it, and then leaps onto its back. Horse and boy bond instantly. Alexander names him Bucephalus, and the two will be inseparable for the next 20 years, until the horse's death in India. Philip, watching his son ride back in triumph, reportedly says with tears in his eyes, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you. That kingdom will have to be won with blood." At 16, Alexander gets his first taste of command when Philip leaves him as regent while campaigning against Byzantium. A Thracian tribe rebels, and Alexander doesn't hesitate. He leads an army against them, defeats them decisively, drives out the barbarian inhabitants, and settles the area with Greeks, founding a city he names Alexandropolis, the first of many cities that will bear his name. 2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, 18-year-old Alexander commands the Macedonian cavalry in the decisive battle that makes Philip master of Greece. Leading a charge at the critical moment, Alexander breaks through the Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 300 warriors who have never been defeated. They die to the last man rather than surrender, and Greece falls under Macedonian control. But victory brings new tensions. Philip takes another wife, a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, potentially displacing Alexander in the succession. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle drunkenly toasts to a legitimate heir, implying that Alexander, son of the foreign Olympias, is somehow less worthy. Alexander hurls his cup at the man, shouting, "What am I then? A bastard?" Philip, drunk himself, draws his sword and lunges at his own son, only to trip and fall. Alexander, standing over his fallen father, says mockingly, "Here is the man who would cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." Mother and son flee Macedonia that night, and though they eventually return, the rift never fully heals. Then, in 336 BC, comes the assassination. During the wedding celebration of Philip's daughter, a bodyguard named Pausanias stabs Philip to death in the theater. The motives remain murky. Was it personal revenge for a private grievance? A conspiracy involving Olympias? A plot by Persian agents to prevent Philip's planned invasion of Asia? We will never know for certain. What matters is that 20-year-old Alexander is suddenly king of Macedonia, and his position is anything but secure. He has enemies at court, rivals for the throne, and a Greek alliance that might dissolve at any moment. Lesser men might have focused on consolidation, on securing what they had. But Alexander is not a lesser man. Within 2 years, he will have crushed all opposition, cowed Greece into submission, and stood on the shores of Asia, ready to achieve what his father had only dreamed of. The making of the conqueror is complete. Now comes the conquest. Chapter 2. Securing the throne. The moment Philip's blood soaks into the theater floor, Macedonia teeters on the edge of chaos. Alexander's claim to the throne is not automatic or uncontested. In the brutal world of Macedonian court politics, succession often goes to the strongest, not necessarily to the eldest son. Alexander has potential rivals, his cousin Amyntas, who has a claim through Philip's brother, Philip's newest wife, Cleopatra, and her infant son, various nobles who might prefer a more pliable king. The 20-year-old must move with decisive speed, and he does. Within hours of his father's death, Alexander appears before the Macedonian army assembly, the body that technically confirms the king. With his father's closest generals Antipater and Parmenion supporting him, the soldiers proclaim him king with their shields and spears. A proclamation is not enough. That very night, Alexander's agents move through the palace. Cleopatra and her infant son are murdered, eliminating that threat to the succession. Over the following weeks, anyone who might contest Alexander's rule meets a similar fate. His cousin Amyntas is executed on charges of conspiracy. 2 Lyncestian princes die, though a third, also named Alexander, is spared because he was among the first to hail the new king. This is the ancient world's harsh calculus. Kill or be killed, rule or die. Alexander understands it perfectly. But securing Macedonia is only the first step. Philip had spent decades bringing Greece under Macedonian control, creating the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek city-states that recognized him as hegemon or leader. Many Greeks had accepted this only because they feared Philip's army. Now that Philip is dead, they see opportunity. In Athens, the great orator Demosthenes, who has spent years denouncing Macedonian tyranny, rejoices publicly at Philip's death. In Thebes and other cities, anti-Macedonian factions call for rebellion. These sophisticated southern Greeks look at 20-year-old Alexander and see an inexperienced boy, a half-barbarian from the north who can surely be cast off like an unwanted cloak. They are about to learn their first lesson about underestimating Alexander of Macedon. Alexander's response demonstrates the combination of speed, diplomacy, and ruthlessness that will characterize his entire career. He marched south with his army so quickly that the Greeks barely have time to organize resistance. City after city, confronted with a Macedonian army at their gates sooner than they thought possible, maxed down. Alexander offers generous terms. Acknowledge him as hegemon of the League of Corinth, just as you did my father, and nothing else need change. Most cities accept. Athens, despite Demosthenes' fiery speeches, decides that discretion is the better part of valor. At a meeting of the League in Corinth, Alexander is confirmed as hegemon and, crucially, as commander of the planned Greek expedition against Persia. This is Philip's legacy and Alexander's inheritance. Leadership of a pan-Hellenic crusade to punish Persia for its invasion of Greece 150 years earlier. While in Corinth, Alexander seeks out Diogenes the Cynic, the famous philosopher who lives in a large ceramic jar and owns nothing but a cloak and a cup. Finding the philosopher sunbathing, Alexander introduces himself and asks if there is anything he can do for him. Diogenes replies, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." Alexander's companions are outraged at this disrespect, but Alexander only laughs and says, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." The story, whether true or legend, reveals something important about Alexander. He respects those who cannot be bought or intimidated, who follow their own path regardless of power. But not everyone can be won with speed and diplomacy. In the spring of 335 BCE, trouble erupts on Macedonia's northern frontier. Thracian and Illyrian tribes are in revolt, and rumors spread that Alexander has been killed in battle. The rumors are false, but they have consequences. In Thebes, one of Greece's most powerful cities, the anti-Macedonian faction seizes control. They murder the Macedonian garrison commander and besiege the citadel where the surviving Macedonians have taken refuge. The Thebans send messengers throughout Greece, calling for a general uprising against Macedonian tyranny. This is the moment of maximum danger for Alexander's rule. If the Greeks unite against him now, while he's fighting barbarians in the north, everything his father built could collapse. Alexander makes a decision that will echo through history. He force-marches his army south, covering the 250 miles from Illyria to Thebes in just 2 weeks. Once again, he arrives before his enemies believe possible. He appears outside Thebes like a ghost, an army that shouldn't exist commanded by a king who is supposed to be dead. Even now, Alexander offers terms. Surrender the rebellion's leaders and submit to the League of Corinth, and the city will be spared. The Thebans, proud of their military tradition and confident in their walls, refuse. They remember their sacred band, the elite unit that had never known defeat until Alexander destroyed them at Chaeronea. They believe they can prevail. They are wrong. The assault on Thebes is brutal and instructive. Alexander's soldiers pour through a poorly defended gate, and once inside the walls, the Macedonians show no mercy. But it's not just Macedonians doing the killing. Alexander has brought allies from other Greek cities that hate Thebes for old grievances. He essentially steps back and lets Greeks kill Greeks, ensuring that the blame for what follows cannot be laid solely at Macedonia's door. By the time the bloodletting ends, 6,000 Thebans lie dead. The survivors, some 30,000 men, women, and children, are sold into slavery. The city itself is razed to the ground, every building destroyed except the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admires. Only the citadel remains standing, a Macedonian garrison overlooking empty ruins, a monument to the price of rebellion. The destruction of Thebes sends shockwaves through Greece. This is not some barbarian village on the frontier. This is one of the great cities of Hellas, home to Epaminondas, and Pindar, destroyer of Athens' empire, the city that defeated Sparta. If Thebes can be wiped from the earth in a single day, what city is safe? Alexander makes sure every Greek understands the message. He technically doesn't order the destruction himself, but allows his allies on the League of Corinth to vote for it, making it a Greek decision rather than a Macedonian one. It's a masterpiece of political theater. Submit to the League and prosper, or resist and face annihilation. The choice is yours. The lesson is learned. Athens, which had been on the verge of supporting Thebes, immediately sends an embassy begging forgiveness for even considering rebellion. Alexander graciously pardons them. Other cities hastily reaffirm their loyalty. In one campaign season, Alexander has secured his northern frontier, destroyed the most dangerous Greek opposition, and terrified the rest of Greece into submission. He is 21 years old. Now, finally, with his rear secure and Greece pacified, he can turn his attention to the great prize, the Persian Empire, the mightiest realm on earth, waiting across the Aegean Sea. Philip's dream of Asian conquest is about to become Alexander's reality, and the known world will never be the same. Chapter 3. Crossing into Asia and the Battle of Granicus in the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander stands on the European shore of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. Before him lies the greatest challenge any Greek commander has ever faced: the Persian Empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to India, from the Caucasus Mountains to Egypt, containing perhaps 50 million people and commanding resources that dwarf anything Macedonia can muster. Philip had planned this invasion but died before launching it. Now it falls to his son to transform dream into reality. As he prepares to cross, Alexander performs a ritual heavy with symbolism. Dressed in full armor, he hurls a spear into the Asian shore, claiming the continent as Spear One territory. Then he sails across in a single ship, ahead of his army, and becomes the first Macedonian to step onto Asian soil. He immediately travels to Troy to sacrifice at the tomb of Achilles, his hero and supposed ancestor. He runs naked around the tomb, as was the custom, and takes from the temple a set of sacred arms set to date from the Trojan War. These he will carry into battle, linking his campaign to the mythic Greek victory over Asia 1,000 years before. The army that follows Alexander across the Hellespont is a magnificent instrument of war, honed by Philip and perfected by Alexander. The corps consists of Macedonian troops, the companion cavalry, heavy horsemen drawn from the nobility, armed with lances and organized in squadrons, the Hydaspes, elite infantry who serve as the link between cavalry and phalanx, and the phalanx itself, thousands of men arrayed in dense formation, bristling with 18-foot sarissas. To this corps, Alexander adds allied Greek infantry, Thessalian cavalry, Thracian and Illyrian light troops, archers from Crete, and a siege train capable of reducing any fortification in the world. The total force numbers perhaps 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, not enormous by Persian standards, but of unmatched quality and cohesion. More importantly, they are led by Alexander and his supremely capable commanders: Parmenion, the old general who served Philip; Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Craterus, and others who will become legends in their own right. The Persian response to Alexander's invasion is curiously passive at first. The great king, Darius III, sits in his distant capital and leaves the defense of Asia Minor to his satraps, the provincial governors. These men, experienced commanders with access to vast resources, make a critical strategic error. Instead of adopting a scorched earth policy that would deny Alexander supplies and force him to retreat, they decide to meet him in open battle, confident that their superior numbers will overwhelm the young Macedonian upstart. They gather their forces near the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor. The regional satraps command Persian cavalry and Greek mercenary infantry, forming an army that roughly equals Alexander's in size. They position themselves on the far bank of the Granicus, a river swollen with spring snowmelt, its banks steep and muddy, its current swift and treacherous. When Alexander's scouts report the Persian position, his older generals urge caution. Parmenion, whose military experience far exceeds Alexander's, points out that crossing a river against an enemy on the opposite bank is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in warfare. The month is late May, almost June, and the Persians might withdraw with the coming of summer. Why not wait, camp for the night, and cross unopposed in the morning? But Alexander will have none of it. He understands that his first battle on Asian soil must be a decisive victory, must demonstrate that Macedonians are superior to Persians in every way. A delayed crossing, a cautious approach, would send the wrong message. He orders an immediate attack in the late afternoon, leading the companion cavalry himself toward the river. What follows is less a battle than a brawl, a chaotic cavalry melee in the shallows of a river. Alexander, always recognizable in his white-plumed helmet and distinctive armor, leads from the absolute front. He crashes into the Persian cavalry just as they are trying to push the first Macedonians back into the river. The fighting is desperate and personal. Alexander's horse is killed under him, but he fights on foot until another mount is brought. A Persian nobleman strikes him with a sword, cutting through his helmet and wounding his scalp. As the Persian raises his weapon for the killing blow, Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's companions, severs the man's arm with a single sword stroke, saving the king's life. This moment of personal courage and loyalty will make Cletus' later fate all the more tragic. Gradually, through sheer determination and superior fighting skill, the Macedonians force their way up the opposite bank. The Persian cavalry, unable to withstand the Macedonian onslaught, begins to break. This exposes the Greek mercenary infantry, who have been held in reserve. These men, fighting for Persian gold, find themselves abandoned by their Persian employers and surrounded by Alexander's forces. They beg for terms, reminding Alexander that they are Greeks like him. But Alexander will have no mercy for Greeks who fight against Greeks. He sees them as traitors to the Pan-Hellenic cause, and he orders their annihilation. 2,000 Greek mercenaries die on the banks of the Granicus. 2,000 more are sent in chains to Macedonia to work in the mines as a warning to other Greeks who might consider Persian service. It's a harsh lesson in Alexander's vision of what it means to be Greek. The victory at Granicus is strategically decisive. Alexander has defeated a Persian army in his first major battle on Asian soil. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Greek cities throughout Asia Minor, which had been under Persian control for 2 centuries, begin to open their gates to Alexander. He presents himself as a liberator, overthrowing Persian tyranny and restoring Greek freedom. In many cities, he abolishes the tributes they paid to Persia and installs democratic governments. This is brilliant propaganda, aligning his campaign with Greek ideals of liberty while securing wealthy cities and ports without costly sieges. The coastal cities of Ionia, places like Ephesus, Miletus, and Halicarnassus, control critical harbors and trade routes. By winning them over, Alexander both denies them to the Persian fleet and secures his own supply lines. But liberation comes with strings attached. The cities may have democratic governments, but they understand that Alexander is their new master. When he needs money, which is constantly, they contribute. When he needs troops, they provide them. Still, for many Greeks in Asia Minor, Macedonian hegemony is preferable to Persian rule, at least at first. Alexander is careful to respect local customs and religious practices. He makes spectacular sacrifices to Artemis at Ephesus and offers to fund the rebuilding of her great temple, which had burned down years earlier. The Ephesians tactfully decline, saying it would be inappropriate for one god to dedicate a temple to another god. But the gesture wins Alexander tremendous goodwill. Yet not all cities welcome him. Miletus and Halicarnassus, both with strong Persian garrisons and supported by the Persian fleet, choose to resist. Alexander is forced to conduct his first major sieges in Asia. At Miletus, his engineers build siege towers and battering rams while his fleet blockades the harbor. The city falls after a brutal assault. Halicarnassus proves more difficult. The city is defended by Memnon of Rhodes, a brilliant Greek mercenary general in Persian service, and perhaps the only Persian commander who truly understands how to fight Alexander. Memnon conducts a masterful defense, launching sorties that destroy Macedonian siege engines and using the city's formidable fortifications to maximum advantage. After weeks of bloody fighting, Alexander finally breaks into the city, but Memnon and his forces retreat to the citadel and continue to resist. Alexander, unwilling to waste more time on a lengthy siege, leaves a blocking force and moves on. By the end of 334 BCE, less than a year after crossing into Asia, Alexander controls the entire coast of Asia Minor except for a few isolated strongpoints. He has won a major battle, taken numerous cities, and established himself as a formidable conqueror rather than a lucky adventurer. But he has also learned important lessons. The Persian Empire is vast, its resources deep, its commanders sometimes quite capable. The Persian fleet remains powerful and could potentially cut his supply lines or even threaten Macedonia itself. Most ominously, Memnon of Rhodes has proposed a strategic plan to the Persian king: avoid pitched battles with Alexander where the Macedonians are strongest. Instead, use the fleet to carry the war to Greece itself, fomenting rebellion and forcing Alexander to abandon his Asian campaign to defend his home base. It's a brilliant strategy that might have worked. But in the summer of 333 BCE, Memnon falls ill and dies. With him dies perhaps Alexander's most dangerous opponent, and the Persian strategy dies as well. The way is open for Alexander to advance deeper into the heart of the empire. Chapter 4: The Battle of Issus and the Conquest of the Levant. The year 333 BCE finds Alexander marching south along the Mediterranean coast, securing the great cities and ports of the Levantan shore. His strategy is clear: deny the Persian fleet its bases, neutralize its ability to threaten his supply lines, and only then turn inland to face the Persian king directly. It's a methodical plan, almost cautious by Alexander's standards, but it makes perfect strategic sense. What he doesn't expect is that Darius III, the great king of Persia, has decided to stop waiting in his palace and take the field himself at the head of a massive army. The hunter is about to become the hunted. Darius III is not the warrior his predecessors were. He came to the throne through a conspiracy after the previous king was poisoned, and his claim to the royal bloodline is tenuous at best. He's a tall, handsome man who looks every inch a king. but he lacks battlefield experience and strategic vision. What he has is pride, vast resources, and an army that outnumbers Alexander's by at least 3-1. In late autumn of 333 BCE, Darius marched this enormous host to Issus, a coastal plain in southern Asia Minor, and waits for Alexander to come to him. But Alexander has already passed Issus, marching south. The two armies, incredibly, march past each other on opposite sides of a mountain range. When Alexander realizes that Darius is behind him, he can hardly believe his fortune. The Persians have abandoned the open plains where their superior numbers would be decisive and instead positioned themselves on the narrow coastal strip between mountains and sea. At Issus, the battlefield is perhaps 2 miles wide, far too constricted for Darius to deploy his full army effectively. It's a catastrophic strategic blunder, and Alexander recognizes it immediately. He wheels his army around and marches back north through a stormy night. His soldiers exhausted but energized by the prospect of meeting the great king himself in battle. On a November morning in 333 BCE, the two armies face each other across the Panaris River, and the fate of empires hangs in the balance. Darius has deployed his forces with the river as a natural barrier. On his left wing, closest to the mountains, he places his cavalry. In the center, he positions his Greek mercenaries, the best infantry he has, backed by masses of Persian infantry of variable quality. On his right wing, near the sea, more cavalry and light troops. Darius himself stands in the center, in his magnificent chariot, surrounded by his royal bodyguard and the Persian nobility. It's a conventional deployment, solid if unimaginative. Alexander's deployment is anything but conventional. He masses his companion cavalry on his right wing, personally taking command of them. In the center, he places his phalanx. On the left wing, near the sea, he positions Parmenion with the Thessalian cavalry and Greek allied troops. Then, in a move that reveals his tactical genius, he begins shifting troops from his left to his right, thinning his line dangerously, but concentrating overwhelming force at his chosen point of attack. The battle begins with Darius making the first move, sending cavalry and light troops across the river on his right wing to engage Alexander's left. Parmenion's troops hold, but they're under pressure. In the center, the Macedonian phalanx advances to the river, and fierce fighting erupts as they attempt to cross against the Greek mercenaries. This is exactly what Alexander wants. The enemy has attention focused on the center and left, while he prepares the decisive blow on the right. With trumpets sounding and the Macedonians raising their battle cry, Alexander leads the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge directly at the point where Darius stands. This is Alexander's signature move, the hammer blow aimed at the enemy commander himself. The charge is devastating. The companions smash through the Persian left-wing cavalry, then wheel inward, driving toward Darius in the center. The Persian infantry, brave enough individually, are prepared for this kind of shock assault. They begin to waver. Darius, watching the Macedonian cavalry cutting a bloody path straight toward him, makes a decision that will haunt Persian pride for centuries. He turns his chariot and flees the battlefield. The great king of Persia, ruler of millions, abandons his army to save himself. The effect is instantaneous and catastrophic. When the Persians see their king fleeing, their morale collapses. What was an army becomes a mob, a mass of men trying desperately to escape. The Macedonians pursue with savage efficiency. Thousands of Persians die in the rout, cut down as they run or trampled in the chaos. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service, still fighting stubbornly in the center, find themselves surrounded. Unlike at Granicus, some of these men manage to fight their way out and escape. Darius doesn't stop running until he's far from the battlefield, abandoning not just his army but his entire royal camp. Alexander's soldiers sweep through this camp and discover unimaginable wealth: gold, silver, luxurious furniture, exotic animals, chests of coins, and most dramatically, Darius' mother, wife, and children left behind in the king's headlong flight. It's a propaganda disaster for Darius. What kind of king abandons his own family? Alexander, by contrast, treats the royal women with conspicuous courtesy and respect. He visits them the day after the battle, accompanied only by his closest friend Hephaestion. The Persian queen mother, Hydaspes, not knowing which young man is the king, prostrates herself before Hephaestion, who is taller and more physically impressive. When her mistake is pointed out, she's mortified, but Alexander graciously says, "You were not mistaken, mother." He too is Alexander. It's a small moment, but it resonates throughout the Persian Empire. This Macedonian conqueror respects Persian royal dignity, treats captive noblewomen as honored guests rather than slaves, and shows a magnanimity that Darius, in his flight, utterly lacks. The contrast couldn't be sharper, and many Persians begin to wonder if perhaps Alexander would be a better king than Darius. After Issus, Alexander doesn't pursue Darius immediately. This surprises many of his commanders, but Alexander's strategic thinking is clear. He still hasn't neutralized the Persian fleet. Instead of chasing Darius inland, he continues south, methodically conquering the Phoenician coast. These cities, Sidon, Tyre, Gaza, control the great ports and shipyards where the Persian fleet bases. Take them, and the fleet withers away without harbors to refit and resupply. Most cities submit without a fight, preferring Alexander's generous terms to destruction. The Sidonians, who hate the Persians, welcome him as a liberator and even help him select a new king for their city. But Tyre, built on an island half a mile offshore and possessing the most formidable fortifications in the ancient world, chooses defiance. The Tyrians tell Alexander he may sacrifice to their god in the old city on the mainland, but not in the island city itself. It's a carefully calculated insult, implying that Alexander is not their master. For Alexander, this cannot stand. If Tyre's defiance goes unpunished, every other city will think it can resist. He demands the city surrender, and when the Tyrians refuse, he makes a promise that many of his engineers think is insane. He will build a causeway from the mainland to the island and take the city by storm. The siege of Tyre is about to begin, and it will be unlike anything the ancient world has ever seen. Chapter 5. The Siege of Tyre and the March to Egypt. Standing on the coast of Phoenicia in January of 332 BCE, Alexander stares at the island city of Tyre, half a mile across the water. His engineers are skeptical, even pessimistic. The channel separating Tyre from the mainland is not only wide but deep, in some places reaching 120 feet. The island itself bristles with walls 150 feet high, manned by determined defenders who control the sea and can easily resupply from their fleet. Every military advisor counsels patience. Blockade the city, wait for the Persian fleet to disperse, then deal with Tyre later. But Alexander sees only a challenge to be overcome, a city that dares to defy him that must be made an example. He orders construction of a mole, a massive causeway of stone, timber, and earth, to be built from the shore to the city walls. It's an engineering project of staggering ambition, and it begins immediately. The first weeks of construction proceed well enough. Alexander's soldiers and conscripted laborers dump stones and timber into shallow water near the shore, building the causeway wider at the base and narrower at the top as it extends seaward. But as they move into deeper water, problems multiply. The Tyrians send ships to harass the workers with arrows and catapult stones. They dive beneath the mole and pull out the foundation stones. Alexander responds by building two great siege towers on the edge of the advancing causeway, fitted with catapults to drive off the Tyrian ships and covered with hides to protect against fire arrows. For a time, this works, and the causeway creeps steadily toward the island. Then, the Tyrians unleash their masterstroke. They take an old transport ship, fill it with dried branches, pitch, sulfur, and other flammables, and extend long yardarms from the mast, weighted at the ends to tilt the ship's bow downward. They fill the bow with more combustibles, set everything ablaze, and sail this fire ship straight at the siege towers on the mole. The crew leaps overboard at the last moment, and the fire ship crashes into the towers with devastating effect. The flames consume the siege towers, which collapse into the sea. Tyrian ships then attack the causeway itself, tearing away the protective screens and hauling off the siege engines. Months of work go up in smoke and sink beneath the waves. Alexander's soldiers watch in frustration as their labor is destroyed, and murmurs of discontent ripple through the ranks. Perhaps the Tyrians are right. Perhaps their island is unconquerable. Alexander's response is characteristically audacious. If the Tyrians control the sea, he will break their naval superiority. He personally travels to Sidon and other Phoenician cities that have submitted to him, demanding they provide their fleets for his use. The Phoenician cities, seeing which way the wind is blowing and eager to settle old scores with Tyre, comply enthusiastically. Soon Alexander commands a fleet of more than 200 warships, outnumbering and outclassing the Tyrian navy. With naval superiority secured, he returns to Tyre and orders the mole rebuilt, wider than before and protected by his own ships. The Tyrians launch desperate naval attacks, but they're beaten back. Alexander's fleet establishes a blockade, cutting the city off from resupply and reinforcement. The noose is tightening. As the mole finally reaches the island in midsummer 332 BCE, Alexander prepares for the final assault. He brings siege engines by sea, landing them on the mole and along the island's shores. Battering rams pound at Tyre's massive walls while catapults rain stones and flaming projectiles into the city. The Tyrians fight with desperate ingenuity. They drop massive boulders into the sea in front of their walls to prevent ships from approaching. They pour red-hot sand from the battlements that finds its way inside attackers' armor and burns them hideously. They construct rotating wheels set with swords to cut the ropes of siege engines. They even have divers swim out to cut the anchor cables of Macedonian ships. For days the battle rages, with Alexander's forces suffering heavy casualties for minimal gains. The Tyrian walls seem impregnable, their defenders inexhaustible in their courage and resourcefulness. Then, in late July, after 7 months of siege, a section of wall finally crumbles under the relentless pounding of Macedonian rams. Alexander doesn't hesitate. Leading his Hydaspes personally, he storms through the breach. The fighting inside Tyre is vicious and house to house. The Tyrians, knowing what fate awaits them after such prolonged resistance, fight with the desperation of men who have nothing to lose. They contest every street, every building, every rooftop. But Macedonian discipline and Alexander's tactical brilliance gradually overwhelm them. Simultaneously, other Macedonian forces breach the hobble walls and pour into the city from multiple directions. Surrounded and facing defeat, many Tyrians retreat to a temple precinct to make their final stand. The aftermath is terrible. 8,000 Tyrian defenders die in the final assault. Alexander, furious at the casualties his army has suffered and determined to send a message to any other city considering resistance, orders exemplary punishment. 2,000 captured Tyrians are crucified along the beach, their bodies left hanging as a warning visible for miles. The remaining 30,000 inhabitants are sold into slavery. The city that thought itself unconquerable because of its island position is destroyed, and Alexander's mole remains, gradually accumulating sand and silt until, over centuries, it transforms Tyre from an island into a peninsula, which it remains to this day. The siege of Tyre demonstrates both Alexander's absolute determination and the horrific price of resisting him. No city in the path of his conquest will forget this lesson. But even before Tyre falls, Alexander receives interesting diplomatic correspondence. Darius, recovering from his humiliation at Issus and desperate to stop the Macedonian advance, sends envoys with an offer. He will pay an enormous ransom for his family, cede all territories west of the Euphrates River to Alexander, and seal the deal with a marriage alliance between Alexander and one of his daughters. It is an astonishingly generous offer that would give Alexander control of the entire eastern Mediterranean and establish him as Darius' equal. When the offer is read to Alexander's war council, old Parmenion reportedly says, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander's reply has become legendary, and so would I, if I were Parmenion. He rejects Darius' offer with contempt. Alexander doesn't want half of Darius' empire. He wants it all. He sends back a message dripping with arrogance, telling Darius that if he wants his family back, he should come and ask for them in person, as a subject to his king. The war will continue until one of them is utterly defeated. After Tyre's fall, only one significant obstacle remains before Egypt, the city of Gaza. Built on a high mound and defended by a Persian garrison, commanded by a eunuch named Bades, Gaza controls the land route to Egypt and cannot be bypassed. When Alexander demands surrender, Bades refuses, trusting in his walls and his desert position. Alexander, still angry from the Tyre siege and impatient for Egypt, orders an immediate assault. His engineers tell him the city's position on a mound makes it nearly impossible to use siege engines effectively. Alexander orders them to build a ramp, essentially creating a mountain of earth next to the existing mound, high enough to bring siege towers and catapults to bear on the walls. The siege of Gaza lasts 2 months, much shorter than Tyre, but no less brutal. Alexander is wounded twice, once when a catapult bolt pierces his shield and penetrates his shoulder, and again when a stone from a catapult strikes him on the head, temporarily blinding him. But he refuses to leave the siege lines, his wounds bandaged, his presence inspiring his troops to superhuman efforts. Finally, in November 332 BCE, the walls are breached. The Macedonians pour in, and Gaza falls in an orgy of violence. All the men are killed, all the women and children sold into slavery. As for Bades, who personally wounded Alexander during one assault, the king orders a punishment deliberately echoing Homer's Iliad. Bades's ankles are pierced, bronze rings threaded through them, and he is dragged around the city walls behind a chariot until dead, just as Achilles dragged Hector around Troy. It is a cruel gesture that reveals the darker aspects of Alexander's character. His vindictiveness toward those who wound him personally, his belief in his own mythic destiny, and his willingness to commit atrocities when his pride is injured. With Gaza crushed, the road to Egypt lies open. Alexander marched his army across the Sinai Desert in just 7 days, arriving at the ancient border of Egypt in late November 332 BCE. What he finds astonishes him. The Egyptians, who have chafed under Persian rule for 2 centuries, welcome him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persian satrap, recognizing the futility of resistance, surrenders without a fight. Egyptian priests hail Alexander as Pharaoh, son of the gods, deliverer of Egypt from the hated Persians. After months of bitter sieges and constant warfare, Alexander finds himself in control of one of the world's oldest and richest civilizations, and its people are treating him like a god. It's a heady experience for a 24-year-old king, and it will profoundly influence his future actions and his conception of himself. Alexander spends the winter of 332 to 331 BCE in Egypt, and he uses the time productively. He travels up the Nile to Memphis, the ancient capital, where Egyptian priests perform traditional coronation ceremonies, formally making him pharaoh. He offers lavish sacrifices to Egyptian gods, particularly Apis, the sacred bull, demonstrating his respect for Egyptian religion. This is classic Alexander. He understands that conquest must be followed by legitimation, that military victory must be transformed into political authority. and that respecting local customs wins more loyalty than force alone ever can. The Egyptians, observing how differently he behaves from the Persians, who had desecrated their temples and mocked their gods, begin to see him as Egypt's rightful ruler. But Alexander's most significant act in Egypt is the founding of a new city. On the Mediterranean coast, where a small Egyptian fishing village sits on a strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis, Alexander orders the construction of a great port city. He personally traces out the city's boundaries, the locations of temples and the agora, the circuit of the walls. When his architects run out of chalk, he uses barley meal to mark the lines, and flocks of birds descend to eat it, which seers interpret as a sign that the city will feed many nations. Alexander names the city after himself, Alexandria. It's perhaps the 15th or 20th city he's named, Alexandria, but this one will eclipse all others, becoming one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of learning, culture, and commerce that will endure for centuries after Alexander himself is dust. Today, more than 2,000 years later, Alexandria remains a great Egyptian city, Alexander's most enduring monument. While in Egypt, Alexander makes a journey that will become wrapped in legend and mystery. He travels west across the desert to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world. The journey is perilous. His party gets lost in the desert and is saved only by miraculous rainfall, or, according to some accounts, by ravens or serpents sent by the gods to guide them. When he finally reaches the oracle, the high priest greets him as son of Amun, which in Egyptian tradition is simply the proper title for pharaoh, but which Alexander interprets as literal divine sonship. What questions Alexander asks the oracle and what answers he receives remain known only to him. He never reveals the full details, saying only that he heard what his heart desired. But from this moment forward, Alexander begins to believe in his own divinity, or at least to encourage others to believe it. Whether this is genuine religious conviction, political calculation, or some combination of both remains one of history's great mysteries. By spring of 331 BCE, Alexander is ready to leave Egypt and march east to the final confrontation with Darius. Egypt is secure, providing vast grain supplies for his army and controlling the southern coast of the Mediterranean. His strategic plan to neutralize the Persian fleet by capturing its bases is complete. His rear is secure, his army rested and reinforced, his treasury full from Egyptian wealth. Most importantly, his prestige has never been higher. In just 3 years, he has conquered Asia Minor, Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt. He has defeated Persian armies at Granicus and Issus. He has captured cities thought impregnable, and he has been hailed as a god-king by one of the world's oldest civilizations. Now comes the ultimate test, meeting Darius and the full might of the Persian Empire in a final decisive battle that will determine who rules the known world. Alexander marched north and east, ready for Armageddon. Chapter 6. Gaugamela. In the late summer of 331 BCE, Alexander crosses from Egypt back into Asia, moving through Syria and toward Mesopotamia. Intelligence reports inform him that Darius III has spent the past 2 years raising a new army, an enormous host drawn from every corner of the vast Persian Empire. This time, there will be no mistakes, no narrow battlefields that neutralize Persian numerical superiority. Darius has chosen the ground carefully. The plains near Gaugamela, close to ancient Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq. The terrain is flat, perfect for cavalry operations and for the chariots Darius has prepared. The Persian king has even had the ground leveled and smoothed to ensure his scythe-bearing chariots can operate at maximum effectiveness. He will deploy his full strength, and Alexander will have nowhere to hide, no terrain advantages to exploit. It will be a pure test of armies, and Darius's force outnumbers Alexander's by at least 2 to 1, possibly more. Alexander reaches the area in September 331 BCE and makes camp within sight of the Persian army. That night, his commanders urge him to launch a surprise night attack, arguing that darkness will offset the Persian numerical advantage and create chaos in their ranks. But Alexander refuses with a statement that becomes famous: "I will not steal victory." Whether this is supreme confidence, arrogance, or sound military judgment is debatable. A night battle is unpredictable and could just as easily result in Macedonian disaster if his troops become disoriented. Better to fight in daylight, where Macedonian discipline and Alexander's tactical genius can have full effect. Besides, he wants there to be no doubt, no asterisks in the historical record. When he defeats Darius, it must be total and unquestionable. The night before battle, Alexander sleeps soundly while his commanders pace nervously. When they finally wake him late in the morning, surprised by how well he is rested, he explains that now he can sleep peacefully because Darius has finally decided to fight rather than retreat. For months, Alexander's great fear has been that Darius would avoid battle, trading space for time, drawing the Macedonians deeper into Asia until their supply lines snapped and their army melted away from disease and desertion. Now Darius has staked everything on a single battle, and Alexander couldn't be more pleased. On October 1st, 331 BCE, the two armies face each other across the plain of Gaugamela, and the fate of the Persian Empire hangs in the balance. Darius has deployed his forces with care. In the center stands the king himself with the Persian royal guard and the best Persian infantry, flanked by Greek mercenaries who have remained loyal to Persian gold. On both wings, he masses his cavalry, Bactrians and Scythians on the left, Parthians and Persians on the right. In front of the center, he positions 200 scythe-bearing chariots, deadly weapons designed to cut through infantry formations. He even has 15 war elephants from India, terrifying beasts the Macedonians have never faced. Behind the main line, he positions a second line of reserves. The Persian army extends far beyond Alexander's on both flanks, threatening to envelop the Macedonians completely. It's a sound, conventional deployment backed by overwhelming numbers. Darius's plan is simple: use the chariots to disrupt the Macedonian phalanx, then envelope and crush them through sheer weight of numbers. Alexander's deployment is superficially similar, but contains crucial innovations. He arrays his phalanx in the center, but he angles his entire line toward the right, marching obliquely toward that flank rather than straight ahead. This confuses the Persians, who are unsure whether Alexander is trying to avoid their prepared ground or seeking some advantage they can't perceive. On his right wing, Alexander masses his companion cavalry along with his best infantry, the Hydaspes and specialized units. On the left, Parmenion commands the Thessalian cavalry and allied troops. But Alexander's real innovation is his use of reserves. Behind his main line, he positions a second phalanx facing to the rear, ready to counter any Persian troops that might break through or come around the flanks. He's essentially created a square formation that can defend in all directions, a brilliant adaptation to fighting a numerically superior enemy. The battle opens with Darius launching his scythe chariots, 200 vehicles of death rolling toward the Macedonian phalanx. But Alexander has prepared for this. His light infantry archers and javelin throwers showered the chariots with missiles, targeting the horses and drivers. Many chariots are stopped before reaching the Macedonian lines. Those that do get through find the phalanx opening up corridors, the men stepping aside to let the chariots pass harmlessly through, then closing ranks again. The chariots that penetrate to the Macedonian rear find the second phalanx waiting and are quickly destroyed. Darius's great tactical innovation has failed, and the battle has barely begun. Persian morale takes its first blow. Now begins the great cavalry battle on both wings. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion faces overwhelming numbers of Persian cavalry trying to envelope his flank. The fighting is desperate, and Parmenion sends messengers to Alexander begging for reinforcements. But Alexander has already seen his opportunity. As the Persian right-wing cavalry wheel to attack Parmenion, they pull away from the Persian center, creating a gap in Darius' line. This is the moment Alexander has been waiting for, the moment his entire battle plan has been designed to create. Leading his companion cavalry personally, Alexander charges directly into this gap, driving like a spear point toward Darius himself, exactly as he did at Issus. The charge is devastating. The companions smash through Persian infantry that isn't prepared for a heavy cavalry assault. Alexander's Hydaspes follow closely, widening the breach. Within minutes, Alexander is within sight of Darius' royal chariot again, and once again, Darius faces the terrifying spectacle of the Macedonian king, blood-spattered and unstoppable, thundering toward him with death in his eyes. And once again, Darius breaks. He wheels his chariot and flees the battlefield, abandoning his army just as he did at Issus. The center of the Persian army, seeing their king flee, begins to disintegrate, but the battle is far from over. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion is in serious trouble. Persian cavalry has not only enveloped his flank, but has broken through to the Macedonian rear, where they attack the baggage train. Some Persian cavalry units, possibly not realizing that Darius has fled, continue fighting with desperate courage. For a terrible moment, the battle's outcome hangs in doubt. If Parmenion's wing collapses, Alexander could find himself surrounded and destroyed despite his success in the center. But Parmenion's Thessalian cavalry holds firm, fighting with extraordinary discipline against superior numbers. Alexander, receiving Parmenion's increasingly desperate messages, is forced to break off his pursuit of Darius and wheel his cavalry back to relieve the pressure on his left wing. This wheeling movement brings Alexander's companions into collision with Persian cavalry units that are still fighting fiercely, unaware their king has fled. The resulting cavalry battle is the most intense of the day, a swirling melee where the Macedonians' superior training and Alexander's presence finally tip the balance. The Persian cavalry breaks, and suddenly the entire Persian army is in flight. What was an organized battle becomes a rout, with Macedonians pursuing fleeing Persians across the plain. The casualties tell the story. Alexander loses perhaps 1,000 men, while Persian dead number in the tens of thousands. It's not just a victory, it's annihilation. In the aftermath of Gaugamela, the strategic situation transforms completely. Darius flees east with the remnants of his royal cavalry, hoping to raise new armies from the distant satrapies. But his credibility is shattered. He has now fled from battle twice, abandoning his armies both times. Persian nobles begin to question whether such a king deserves their loyalty. Alexander, meanwhile, turns south toward the great cities of Mesopotamia. Babylon, the most magnificent city in Asia, opens its gates without resistance. The population lines the streets to welcome Alexander, throwing flowers and burning incense. The Persian satrap surrenders the city's treasury, which contains 50,000 talents of gold and silver, an unimaginable fortune that will fund Alexander's campaigns for years to come. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa, another great Persian capital, which also surrenders without a fight. Here he finds even greater wealth, 40,000 talents of gold and silver, plus the statues that the Persians had looted from Athens 150 years earlier during their invasion of Greece. Alexander sends these statues back to Athens, a powerful propaganda gesture that reinforces his role as avenger of Greek wrongs. Then comes Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the city where the great kings have been crowned for 2 centuries. Persepolis does not surrender peacefully. A Macedonian force must fight its way through the Persian gates, a narrow mountain pass defended by the last significant Persian army in the region. After a costly battle and a brilliant flanking maneuver, Alexander breaks through and descends upon Persepolis. What happens next remains controversial. After allowing his soldiers to plunder Persepolis, Alexander orders the royal palace burned. Ancient sources disagree on why. Some claim it was deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens, the symbolic culmination of the Pan-Hellenic crusade. Others suggest it happened during a drunken party when Alexander, as companion, Tyre urged him to torch the palace as payback for Persian sacrilege. Whatever the truth, the burning of Persepolis marks a turning point. Alexander has moved beyond being a Macedonian king leading a Greek crusade. He is now the de facto ruler of the Persian Empire, and burning its greatest palace is a strange act for someone who claims to be Persia as legitimate king. Perhaps Alexander is still figuring out exactly what he wants to be, Greek avenger or Persian emperor. The contradiction will only deepen as his conquest continues eastward. Chapter 7. The pursuit of Darius, with the great Persian cities secured and their treasuries emptied into his war chest. Alexander faces a decision that will define the nature of his entire enterprise. Darius III, though defeated and humiliated, still lives and still claims to be the great king. As long as Darius breathes, Alexander's position remains ambiguous. Is he a conqueror or a usurper? A liberator or an invader? The answer requires Darius's complete elimination, either through capture or death. In the spring of 330 BC, Alexander sets out in pursuit of the fleeing Persian king, beginning a chase that will take him into the furthest reaches of the Eastern Empire and transform him from a Macedonian warrior king into something far more complex and troubling. Darius has fled to Ecbatana, the summer capital of the Persian Empire in the Zagros Mountains, where he attempts to rally support for continued resistance. But the situation is desperate. His double flight from battle has destroyed his authority. Persian nobles, who might have supported a king who fought and lost, find it impossible to follow one who repeatedly ran away. When Alexander approaches Ecbatana, Darius flees again, this time heading northeast toward the satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana, the wild frontier regions of the empire. He is accompanied by a few thousand soldiers and several of his most powerful nobles, including Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. Before leaving Ecbatana in pursuit, Alexander makes a significant decision. He formally disbands the League of Corinth forces, the Greek allied troops who joined his campaign under the pretense of a Pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. He pays them generously and offers bonuses to any who wish to stay on as mercenaries. But the official Greek participation in the war is over. The symbolism is clear. Alexander is no longer fighting as the hegemon of Greece against Persia. He's fighting as the self-proclaimed king of Asia, and what lies ahead is no longer a Greek concern. Many soldiers accept their discharge and head home. Others, either out of loyalty to Alexander or love of adventure and plunder, sign on as mercenaries. The army that pursues Darius is thus a more professional, less ideologically motivated force, which is exactly what Alexander needs for the challenges ahead. The pursuit of Darius becomes a race against time. Alexander pushes his men brutally hard, covering enormous distances at speeds that exhaust men and horses alike. He divides his forces, leaving the slower infantry to follow while he takes his cavalry and lightest troops ahead. The distance separating hunter and hunted shrinks day by day. But as Alexander closes in, a conspiracy unfolds in Darius's camp. Bessus and other nobles, seeing that Darius's capture is inevitable, decide to take matters into their own hands. If they hand Darius over to Alexander, they might win favorable terms. Better yet, if they kill Darius themselves, one of them might claim the kingship and continue the resistance. In July 330 BCE, somewhere in the remote regions east of the Caspian Sea, these nobles arrest Darius and put him in chains. Alexander, learning of this development, pushes even harder. He rides through the night with a small force of cavalry, desperate to reach Darius before the conspirators can complete whatever plan they have. But he arrives too late. When Macedonian scouts finally locate the Persian baggage train, they find it abandoned, except for a few wounded stragglers and a cart containing a dying man covered in javelin wounds. It is Darius III, King of Kings, great king of Persia, stabbed by his own nobles and left to die on a dusty road like a common criminal. According to legend, Darius lives just long enough to speak to a Macedonian soldier, asking for water and expressing gratitude that he will not die completely alone. Whether Alexander actually sees Darius alive or only finds his corpse is unclear, but the political implications are crystal clear. The great king of Persia is dead, and Alexander is the only remaining claimant to his throne. Alexander's response to Darius's death reveals his evolving self-conception. He sends Darius's body back to Persepolis for a royal burial in the tombs of his ancestors, treating the defeated king with every honor due to royalty. He wears Persian mourning garments and declares himself the avenger of Darius's murder, vowing to hunt down and punish the regicides. This is masterful political theater. To the Persians, Alexander presents himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as Darius's legitimate successor, the rightful king who will restore order and punish those who violated sacred loyalty to their monarch. To his Macedonians, he's pursuing criminals who killed an anointed king, a crime that resonates with them given Philip's assassination. Alexander is transforming himself from conqueror to continuator, from destroyer of Persia to its new incarnation. But this transformation comes with costs that become increasingly apparent. Alexander begins adopting Persian royal customs and dress. He wears the upright tiara of Persian kings and the royal purple and white striped tunic. He introduces elements of Persian court ceremony, including proskynesis, the practice of bowing or prostrating before the king. To Persians, this is simply proper respect for royalty. To Macedonians and Greeks, it's something done only before gods. And demanding, it seems to confirm their worst fears about Alexander's growing megalomania. The Macedonian nobility, who have fought beside Alexander as companions and near equals, find themselves expected to treat him as an oriental despot. Tension begins to build between Alexander's Macedonian identity and his Persian aspirations. The pursuit of Bessus and the other regicides takes Alexander into Bactria and Sogdiana, the northeastern frontier of the former Persian Empire, corresponding roughly to modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. This is hard country. Mountains, deserts, fierce tribal peoples who bow to no king. Bessus has proclaimed himself great king with the royal name Artaxerxes V, but his support is thin. As Alexander approaches with his army, Bessus's allies melt away. The local satrap Spitamenes, recognizing Alexander's inevitable victory, arrests Bessus and sends him to Alexander in chains. Alexander's revenge is terrible and calculated to send a message. Bessus is mutilated, his nose and ears cut off in the Persian manner of punishing traitors, then sent back to Ecbatana for trial and execution. The regicide has been punished, and Alexander's claim to be Darius's avenger is validated. But securing Bactria and Sogdiana proves far more difficult than defeating Bessus. These frontier regions have never been fully controlled even by the Persians, and the local people see no reason to submit to Alexander simply because he claims to be the new great king. Spitamenes, the noble who handed over Bessus, quickly turns against Alexander and becomes the leader of a widespread guerrilla insurgency. For the next 2 years, Alexander will face his most frustrating campaign, fighting not set-piece battles where his military genius can shine, but endless skirmishes and ambushes against an enemy that refuses to stand and fight. It's a grinding, demoralizing conflict that tests the Macedonian army's endurance and discipline to their limits. The fighting in Central Asia is savage on both sides. Alexander employs scorched earth tactics, destroying villages that support the insurgents. He builds a network of fortified towns settled with Macedonian and Greek veterans, creating permanent garrisons to hold the territory. These cities, many named Alexandria, become islands of Greco-Macedonian culture in a hostile land. But the cost is high. Macedonian soldiers die in ambush, from disease, from the brutal climate. Morale begins to fray. These men signed up to conquer Persia and become rich with plunder. They've achieved that. Many are wealthy beyond their dreams. What are they still doing fighting tribesmen in these God's forsaken mountains? Alexander himself is changing in disturbing ways. The young king who showed clemency to defeated enemies is becoming harsher, more paranoid, more violent. The combination of constant warfare, increasing isolation from his Macedonian roots, heavy drinking, and his own grandiose self-conception is creating a volatile, dangerous personality. Small acts of disrespect enrage him. Criticism is taken as near treason. The cultural tension between his Macedonian and Persian identities is tearing him apart, and those around him are caught in the crossfire. The stage is being set for tragedies that will stain Alexander's reputation forever and reveal the darkness that can accompany absolute power, especially in one who believes himself descended from gods. Chapter 8. Treachery and Murder. The winter of 328 BC finds Alexander's court at Maracanda, modern Samarkand, a jewel of an oasis city in the heart of Sogdiana. The Central Asian campaign grinds on with no end in sight. Spinamanes continues his guerrilla war, and the Macedonian army is tired, frustrated, and beginning to question why they are still fighting in these remote lands when Persia itself has long since been conquered. The cultural tensions between Alexander's Macedonian companions and the Persian nobles he is increasingly incorporating into his court are reaching a breaking point. Into this powder keg, Alexander throws a spark of wine-fueled rage that will result in murder and forever tarnish his legacy. The trouble begins at a drinking party, a symposium in the Greek style, but with drinking on a Macedonian scale, which is to say excessive and competitive. Alexander and his companions are deep in their cups when the conversation turns to Alexander's achievements. Flatterers begin comparing him favorably to the gods, to Heracles and Dionysus, suggesting his conquests exceed theirs. Someone claims that Alexander has accomplished more than his father Philip ever did. This is too much for Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions, the man who saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus by cutting off a Persian's arm as he raised his sword for the killing blow. Cletus, drunk and angry at how Alexander has been adopting Persian customs and elevating Persians to positions of power, begins to speak his mind with the bluntness of wine and old friendship. Cletus praises Philip's achievements, suggesting that Alexander owes everything to his father's foundation. He reminds everyone that it was he, Cletus, who saved Alexander's life at Granicus, not some god. He mocks the Persians present, reminding them that these same men fought against Macedonia until Alexander defeated them. He quotes from Euripides, lines about how terrible it is when ordinary soldiers do the fighting while kings take all the credit. With each statement, the atmosphere in the hall grows more tense. Alexander's face darkens with rage. His companions try to quiet Cletus, to drag him from the hall before disaster strikes, but Cletus is beyond caring. Years of resentment at Alexander's transformation, at his Persian pretensions, at his god-king posturing, come pouring out in a drunken torrent. What happens next occurs in seconds, but will haunt Alexander for the rest of his life. Alexander, in a fury, snatches a spear from one of his guards and hurls it at Cletus. The spear catches Cletus in the chest, and the man who saved Alexander's life at Granicus falls dead, killed by the hand of his king. The hall falls silent. Alexander, suddenly sober, stares at what he's done. He tries to throw himself on the spear, to kill himself, but his guards restrain him. He collapses in anguish, calling out Cletus's name. For 3 days, Alexander locks himself in his quarters, refusing food and water, alternately weeping and calling for his dead friend. His friends worry he might actually die from grief or starve himself to death. Finally, court seers and philosophers convince him that the killing was fated, that Cletus was destined to die this way, that Alexander should not blame himself. But everyone knows the truth, In a moment of drunken rage, Alexander murdered one of his oldest friends, one of the men who had fought beside him from the beginning. The murder of Cletus marks a turning point in how Alexander's companions view him. The young king they followed out of Macedonia has become something else, unpredictable, dangerous, capable of killing even his closest friends in a fit of rage. The drinking parties continue because Macedonian culture revolves around them, but now there's an undercurrent of fear. Men watch their words more carefully. The easy camaraderie of earlier years is gone, replaced by the careful deference one shows to a tyrant. And Alexander himself is changing, driven by guilt and grandiosity in equal measure. His Persian pretensions growing more pronounced as he distances himself from the Macedonian identity that now reminds him of his crime. The following year, 327 BCE, brings an even more disturbing episode. This one calculated rather than spontaneous. Alexander decides to formally introduce proskynesis, the Persian practice of bowing or prostrating before the king, as a required court ceremony for all his subjects, Persians and Macedonians alike. His reasoning is partly practical. He rules over Persians who expect a show of deference, and he wants to create a unified court protocol that doesn't distinguish between Persian and Macedonian. But it's also about power and divinity. Alexander increasingly believes, or wants others to believe, that he is the son of Zeus Ammon, a living god who deserves worship. To Macedonians, however, proskynesis is something done only before gods, and forcing them to do it is asking them to acknowledge Alexander as divine. Alexander arranges a test of this new ceremony at a court banquet. A loving cup is passed around, and each man drinks, performs proskynesis before Alexander, and receives a kiss from the king in return. Most Persian nobles do this without hesitation. It's familiar to them. Some Macedonian and Greek nobles do it too, either out of genuine acceptance or calculated ambition. But when the cup reaches Callisthenes, the official historian of the expedition and a relative of Aristotle, he drinks, approaches Alexander for the kiss, but deliberately omits the proskynesis. Alexander, deep in conversation and perhaps not paying attention, begins to lean forward for the kiss. One of his companions alerts him to the omission, and Alexander withdraws. Callisthenes says loudly enough for others to hear, "Very well, I shall go away the poorer by a kiss." The incident seems minor, but it's politically explosive. Callisthenes has publicly defied the king on a matter of ceremony and divine honors, and he's gotten away with it, because Alexander, perhaps remembering Cletus and wary of another violent scene, doesn't punish him immediately. But Callisthenes has made a powerful enemy. In court, he continues to speak out against Persian customs and what he sees as Alexander's betrayal of Greek and Macedonian values. He becomes a rallying point for the conservative faction that opposes Alexander's transformation into an Oriental monarch. Alexander, surrounded by flatterers and Persians, comes to see Callisthenes as a dangerous subversive, poisoning his men's minds against their king. The crisis comes to a head with what becomes known as the conspiracy of the pages. The royal pages are young nobles who serve in Alexander's court, essentially cadets being trained for future command. One of these pages, Hermolos, is flogged by Alexander for a minor breach of court protocol during a hunt. Humiliated and angry, Hermolos organizes a conspiracy among several other pages to assassinate Alexander. They plan to kill him in his sleep when it's their turn to guard his chamber. But the night of the planned assassination, Alexander drinks until dawn, never going to bed, and the opportunity passes. The next day, one of the conspirators loses his nerve and confesses to his lover, who reports it to Alexander. The pages are arrested, tortured, and quickly confess. Under interrogation, Hermolos declares that he was driven to conspiracy by Alexander's murder of Cletus, his adoption of Persian dress and customs, and his demand for proskynesis. He claims to have been influenced by Callisthenes' teachings about Greek freedom and the impropriety of treating a mortal as a god. This is all the pretext Alexander needs. Though there's no evidence that Callisthenes was directly involved in the conspiracy, he's arrested and charged with inspiring it through his teachings and criticism of Alexander. The pages, all from noble families, are tried before the Macedonian army assembly according to tradition. They confess their guilt and are stoned to death by the assembled soldiers. Callisthenes, being Greek rather than Macedonian, isn't given such a trial. Instead, he's kept in chains with the army, dying either from torture, disease, or execution. The sources disagree on which. His death sends a chilling message. Even indirect criticism of Alexander, even philosophical objections to his divine pretensions, can be fatal. The free speech that characterized the early campaigns is gone, replaced by fearful silence punctuated only by sycophantic flattery. The deaths of Cletus and Callisthenes, coming within months of each other, reveal the psychological toll that absolute power and endless conquest are taking on Alexander. The young king who once showed magnanimity to defeated enemies has become paranoid, seeing conspiracy in every criticism. The leader who fought shoulder to shoulder with his men has become an isolated monarch surrounded by courtiers who tell him only what he wants to hear. The Macedonian warrior has become an oriental despot who demands worship. His companions, who once loved him, now fear him. And yet, despite these dark transformations, or perhaps because of them, Alexander's military genius remains undiminished. He is about to embark on conquests that will take him beyond even the old Persian Empire's boundaries, into lands that no Greek or Macedonian has ever seen. By late 327 BCE, Alexander has finally crushed the insurgency in Bactria and Sogdiana. Spitamenes is dead, betrayed by his own allies, and his head sent to Alexander as a peace offering. The countryside is dotted with new Alexandrias, garrison towns that will slowly Hellenize the region over the coming centuries. Alexander has married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, a political marriage meant to cement his control over the region, but one that also produces genuine affection. Roxana is beautiful, and Alexander seems genuinely smitten, though this doesn't prevent him from taking other wives later. With Central Asia secured, at least nominally, Alexander looks further east, toward a land the Greeks know only from legend and rumor: India. The decision to invade India is vintage Alexander. Ambitious, risky, driven by an insatiable desire to see what lies beyond the next horizon. His stated justification is that the old Persian Empire once claimed parts of northwestern India as vassalages, and as the new great king, he must restore Persian authority over these territories. But everyone knows the real reason. Alexander cannot stop conquering. He's driven by a hunger that no amount of territory can satisfy, and need to prove himself beyond all limits. India represents the edge of the known world to Greeks. Beyond it, some believe, lies ocean, the great river that encircles the earth. If Alexander can reach ocean, he will have literally conquered the world. How can he resist such a prize? Preparations for the Indian campaign are extensive. Alexander spends the winter of 327-326 BCE organizing his forces and gathering intelligence about what lies ahead. He learns that India is not a unified empire but a patchwork of kingdoms and republics, some powerful, others small and weak. The most powerful king in the northwest is Porus, who rules the land beyond the Hydaspes River. Some Indian rulers, seeing opportunity, send embassies to Alexander offering alliance against their rivals. Others prepare to resist the foreign invader. Alexander assembles a massive force. His veteran Macedonians, Greek allies, Persian troops, Central Asian cavalry, and a newly recruited contingent of soldiers from the territories he's conquered. The logistics are staggering, supplying an army of perhaps 75,000 men marching through mountain passes and across alien territories. In spring 326 BCE, Alexander crosses the Hindu Kush Mountains and descends into the Indus Valley. The initial campaign goes smoothly. Several Indian rulers submit immediately, recognizing the futility of resistance. The city of Taxila, one of the great centers of Indian culture and learning, welcomes Alexander as an ally against its rival Paris. Alexander is fascinated by the Indian philosophers he meets there, the gymnosophists or naked philosophers who live in extreme asceticism and claim to have mastered desire itself. He engages them in philosophical debates that reveal his continuing intellectual curiosity despite his transformation into a god-king. But as always with Alexander, philosophical discussions are merely interludes between campaigns. One Indian ruler who refuses submission is the chieftain of a mountain fortress called Ionos, identified by the Greeks with a fortress that even Heracles supposedly failed to capture. This is irresistible to Alexander, who must prove himself superior to his mythical ancestor. The siege of Ionos is an engineering marvel. The fortress sits atop a massive rock formation, rising more than 5,000 feet above the surrounding plain, accessible only by one difficult path. Alexander's engineers build a massive ramp of earth and timber, raising it higher and higher until siege engines can be brought within range of the walls. After fierce fighting, the defenders abandon the fortress in the night, and Alexander claims to have succeeded where Heracles failed. It's a militarily unnecessary achievement, undertaken purely for mythological bragging rights, but it demonstrates Alexander's undiminished ability to accomplish the supposedly impossible. Now comes the greatest challenge of the Indian campaign. King Paris and his army wait on the far side of the Hydaspes River, swollen with monsoon rains. Paris has brought his full strength to oppose Alexander, including the weapon that will prove most difficult for the Macedonians to face: war elephants. Not just the handful that Darius had at Gaugamela, but hundreds of them. Massive beasts that tower over cavalry and can trample infantry like grass. Paris positions his army on the far bank of the river and waits. He knows that crossing a river against a prepared enemy is nearly impossible, and with elephants backing his line, he's confident the Macedonians will break themselves against his defense. Alexander, staring across the rain-swollen river at an army he cannot simply charge, faces one of the most complex tactical problems of his career. The solution he devises will demonstrate that even in India, at the edge of the known world, after years of conquest and corruption, his military genius remains unmatched. Chapter 9. The Battle of Hydaspes. The monsoon rains hammer down on Alexander's camp on the banks of the Hydaspes River in May 326 BCE, across the brown, swollen waters. King Paris waits with his army arrayed on the opposite shore. Infantry, cavalry, chariots, and most dramatically, 200 war elephants forming a living wall of flesh and tusks. The river is too deep to ford, too swift to cross easily, and attempting an opposed river crossing against an army backed by elephants would be suicidal. For weeks, Alexander and Paris engage in a strategic stalemate, each watching the other, waiting for an opportunity or a mistake. But the waiting game is actually part of Alexander's plan, a masterpiece of deception and psychological warfare that will allow him to achieve what seems impossible. Alexander establishes his main camp directly across from Paris's position, but he also stations troops at multiple points along the riverbank, creating the impression that he might cross anywhere. Every day and every night, Macedonian cavalry units ride up and down the river, making noise, building fires, simulating preparations for crossing. The first few times this happens, Paris marched his entire army to the threatened crossing point, exhausting his men and his elephants in false alarms. After several repetitions, Paris begins to ignore these demonstrations, assuming they're all feints. This is exactly what Alexander wants: an enemy so accustomed to false threats that he will be slow to respond to the real one. Alexander has been studying the river carefully, using his scouts to identify a possible crossing point 17 miles upstream. From the main camp, where a wooded island sits in mid-river, and the far bank is hidden from Pyrrhus' observation posts by trees and a bend in the river. One stormy night, Alexander puts his plan into action. He leaves the bulk of his army in the main camp under Craterus' command, with strict orders not to cross until Pyrrhus has been fully engaged elsewhere. Then, with 5,000 cavalry and 10,000 infantry, Alexander marched upstream through the darkness and the rain, using the storm to mask the sound of his movement. At the pre-selected crossing point, he finds boats that have been secretly transported and assembled. As thunder rolls and lightning flashes, Alexander's strike force crosses the river. But even Alexander's planning cannot account for every contingency. What appeared to be the far bank in the darkness turns out to be the island in mid-river. Alexander must cross again, and this time his men must wade through water chest deep, struggling against the current while trying to keep their weapons dry. It's a desperate, exhausting effort, but eventually, the strike force reaches the actual far bank just as dawn breaks. The element of surprise has been achieved, but now comes the race. Can Alexander deploy his army in position for battle before Pyrrhus realizes what is happening and brings his full force to bear? Pyrrhus receives word of Alexander's crossing, but initially believes it's just another demonstration, perhaps a small raiding party. He sends his son with a modest force of chariots and cavalry to investigate and drive the raiders back across the river. This is a fatal miscalculation. Alexander's strike force is not a raiding party, but a substantial army. And when Pyrrhus' son arrives, he finds himself facing the companion cavalry led by Alexander himself. The ensuing skirmish is brief and one-sided. Pyrrhus' son is killed, and his force is routed. Now Pyrrhus understands the magnitude of what has happened. Alexander and a significant portion of his army are across the river and advancing toward him. He must act immediately or be caught between Alexander's force and Craterus' army still on the opposite shore. Pyrrhus makes the brave decision to face Alexander's threat directly. He leaves a small force to watch Craterus and prevent him from crossing, then march with his main army to intercept Alexander on a relatively flat plain where his elephants and chariots can operate effectively. It's here on the rain-soaked plains of the Punjab that one of history's most unusual battles takes place: Macedonian phalanx and cavalry against Indian infantry. Chariots and elephants, two military systems that have never before encountered each other, meeting in decisive combat. Pyrrhus arrays his army with his infantry in the center, his 200 elephants spaced along the line like living towers, cavalry on both wings and chariots in front. It's an intimidating sight designed to terrify the Macedonians. Alexander's response demonstrates his adaptability and tactical brilliance. He cannot use his standard tactic of a cavalry charge at the center because the elephants make this impossible. Horses fear elephants and will not charge them. Instead, he devises a completely different battle plan. He masses his cavalry almost entirely on his right wing, leaving his left nearly undefended. He orders his infantry to advance slowly toward the elephants, but not engage immediately. Then, leading his cavalry, he attacks Pyrrhus' left wing, the cavalry force on that side of the Indian line. The attack is furious and overwhelming, and Pyrrhus' left-wing cavalry begins to crumble. Pyrrhus responds by sending his right-wing cavalry to support his embattled left, exactly as Alexander anticipated. As the Indian cavalry from both wings converges on Alexander's position, trying to surround the Macedonian cavalry, Alexander springs his trap. A Macedonian cavalry force under Coenus, which has been concealed or held in reserve, suddenly appears and strikes the Indian cavalry from behind. Caught between Alexander's companions in front and Coenus' cavalry behind, the Indian horsemen are destroyed in a classic double envelopment. With their cavalry eliminated, the Indian infantry and elephants face the Macedonian phalanx alone. Now begins the strange and terrible battle between men and elephants, unlike anything else in ancient warfare. The Macedonian phalanx advances with their long sarissas pointed at the elephants. The mahouts, the riders controlling the elephants, try to drive the beasts forward, but the forest of spear points causes many elephants to balk. Some are wounded and maddened by the sarissas jabbing at their trunks and eyes, and these wounded elephants become uncontrollable, trampling friend and foe alike. Macedonian javelin throwers and archers target the mahouts. When a mahout is killed, his elephant often runs wild. The elephants that do close with the phalanx cause terrible casualties, using their trunks to grab soldiers and dash them to the ground, crushing men under their feet, impaling others on their tusks. But the disciplined Macedonians hold their formation, and gradually the elephants are either killed, captured, or driven from the field. Many of them so wounded, they collapse from exhaustion and blood loss. With the elephants neutralized, the Indian infantry faces the full weight of the Macedonian phalanx, now reinforced by Craterus's force, which has crossed the river once Paris committed to battle elsewhere. The Indians fight with desperate courage, but they're outmatched in equipment, training, and leadership. The battle becomes a slaughter. By the time the fighting ends, thousands of Indians lie dead on the muddy field, along with many elephants whose bodies will take days to dispose of. Paris himself fights on even after the battle is clearly lost, mounted on an elephant, refusing to flee. He is wounded multiple times, but continues to rally his men until sheer exhaustion and blood loss force him to stop. When Porus is finally captured and brought before Alexander, the Macedonian king asks how he wishes to be treated. Porus, despite his wounds and defeat, replies with magnificent dignity. As a king, Alexander, recognizing in Porus a kindred spirit, a warrior who fought bravely and refused to surrender or flee, is so impressed that he not only restores Porus to his kingdom, but actually expands it, adding territories of rulers who opposed or failed to support Alexander. It's one of Alexander's finest moments of magnanimity, reminiscent of the generous victor of his early campaigns, rather than the paranoid tyrant he's becoming. The mutual respect between Alexander and Porus becomes legendary, a bright spot in the increasingly dark narrative of Alexander's later years. But the Battle of Hydaspes, though a brilliant victory, comes at a terrible cost beyond the casualties. During the battle, Alexander's beloved horse Bucephalus, who has carried him through every major campaign, dies, whether from wounds, exhaustion, or simply old age is unclear. Bucephalus has been Alexander's constant companion for 20 years, since that day in Philip's court when a 10-year-old boy tamed an unmanageable horse by turning it away from its shadow. Alexander is devastated and founds a city on the battlefield named Bucephala in his horse's honor. It's a reminder that Alexander is human despite his divine pretensions, capable of genuine grief for a faithful companion. The victory at Hydaspes solidifies Alexander's control over northwestern India, but it also reveals the limits of what even he can achieve. The battle has been difficult and costly. The elephants, though ultimately defeated, have proven terrifying and effective weapons, inflicting heavy casualties even in defeat. Rumors spread through the army that the kingdoms further east have thousands of elephants, not just hundreds. The Macedonian soldiers, who have been marching and fighting for 8 years, are beginning to wonder where this will all end. They've conquered the Persian Empire, the stated goal of the expedition. They're wealthy beyond their dreams from years of plunder. They followed Alexander to the edge of the known world. How much further must they go? Alexander, standing on the banks of the Hydaspes after his victory, looks east and sees only more lands to conquer. His army looks east and sees only endless toil with no purpose other than feeding their king's insatiable ambition. Chapter 10. Mutiny on the Hydaspes. After the victory at Hydaspes, Alexander reorganizes his forces and prepares to march further into India. His intelligence reports speak of wealthy kingdoms to the east, of the Ganges River Valley with its powerful states and infinite riches. Some claim the Ganges kingdom's field armies of hundreds of thousands with thousands of war elephants. To Alexander, these reports are challenges to be met, obstacles to be overcome. He's fought against overwhelming odds before and always triumphed. India will be no different. He gives orders to march east, and the army begins its advance through the Punjab, conquering or receiving the submission of various tribes and kingdoms. But something is different now. The energy, the enthusiasm, the sense of shared purpose that characterized the early campaigns, all of this is gone, replaced by grim determination and growing resentment. The monsoon season makes everything worse. It rains constantly for days and weeks on end. Equipment rots, food spoils, diseases spread through the camp. The soldiers' gear, much of it dating from the beginning of the campaign 8 years ago, is falling apart. Shields are warped, leather armor is rotting, clothing is in rags. The men themselves are worn out, scarred from dozens of battles, many suffering from old wounds that ache in the damp. They've been marching and fighting since 334 BCE, from Greece to Egypt, from Mesopotamia to Central Asia, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of India. They faced every kind of enemy, every type of terrain. They're the finest soldiers in the world, veterans of legendary campaigns, wealthy from years of plunder. And they've had enough. The crisis comes at the Hydaspes River, the modern Beas River in Punjab. In July 326 BCE, Alexander orders the army to cross the river and continue east. For the first time in the campaign, his soldiers refuse. It starts with murmuring in the ranks, men asking each other why they were still marching when they've already conquered everything they set out to conquer. The discontent spreads to the officers, to the junior commanders, finally to Alexander's senior generals. Granicus, one of Alexander's most capable commanders and a veteran of the entire campaign, becomes the spokesman for the army's grievances. He requests an audience with Alexander, and with enormous courage given Alexander's treatment of critics, speaks the truth. Granicus reminds Alexander of everything the army has accomplished: the defeat of the Persian Empire, the conquest of lands from Greece to India, the accumulation of wealth and glory beyond any previous Greek army. He speaks of the soldiers' exhaustion, their desire to see their homes and families again, the fact that many of the men who set out from Macedonia are now dead, and the survivors are worn out. He notes that of the original Macedonian troops, few remain who are fit for service. He pleads with Alexander to recognize that there are limits to what men can endure, that even the greatest army needs rest, that endless conquest serves no purpose if the conquering army destroys itself in the process. He concludes by saying that if Alexander wishes to continue, he should return to Macedonia, raise a new army of young men eager for glory, and return to complete his conquest of the East. It's a masterful speech, respectful yet firm, acknowledging Alexander's greatness while making clear the army will not continue. Alexander's response is pure fury. He dismisses Granicus and the other officers, then summons them back the next day for a tirade that lasts hours. He accuses them of cowardice, of betraying him at the moment of ultimate triumph. He reminds them of everything he's done for them, the wealth he's given them, the glory they've won. He claims that Ocean, the edge of the world, is just a little further east, that they're on the verge of completing the conquest of the entire world, and they want to stop now? He says he'll find soldiers who are braver, who share his vision, who won't abandon him when victory is in sight. He threatens to continue with only those loyal to him, leaving the cowards behind to explain to history why they failed at the last moment. It's a powerful, passionate speech, but it has no effect. The officers listen in silence and then leave, unmoved. The army will not march east. For 3 days, Alexander remains in his tent, refusing to see anyone, hoping his soldiers will change their minds, that his officers will come begging him to lead them forward. But no one comes. The army is resolute. They followed Alexander to the edge of the world, but they will not follow him over the edge. Finally, Alexander performs sacrifices to determine the god's will concerning the river crossing. The omens, conveniently, are unfavorable. Alexander announces that the gods have spoken, and he will respect their will. He will not cross the Hydaspes. The soldiers cheer wildly, weeping with relief. They rush to Alexander's tent, blessing him and thanking the gods. Some of them kiss his feet. They're going home. But Alexander will have his revenge on Granicus, though it's subtle and possibly coincidental. Shortly after the mutiny, Granicus falls ill and dies. Alexander gives him a magnificent funeral, praising his service and valor. Yet some in the army whisper that Granicus's illness came suspiciously soon after he spoke against Alexander, and that perhaps the king's grief is not entirely genuine. Whether Granicus died from natural causes, from exhaustion and disease after years of campaign, or from something more sinister, will never be known. What's clear is that speaking truth to Alexander is dangerous, even for his most trusted commanders, and that the king's magnanimity has limits. Before turning back, Alexander orders the construction of giant altars on the banks of the Hydaspes, 12 of them, each 60 feet high, dedicated to the 12 Olympian gods. They're monuments to mark the furthest point of his advance, visible for miles around, proclaiming to future generations that Alexander came this far. He also orders his craftsmen to build oversized armor and weapons, twice normal size, and leave them scattered about the camp, creating the impression that his army consisted of giants. It's a last bit of propaganda, an attempt to ensure that even in the lands he doesn't conquer, legends will speak of Alexander's impossible army. Then, with his altars built and his legends planted, he turns his army around and begins the long journey back. The return journey is anything but triumphant. Alexander, furious at being forced to turn back, seems determined to prove that he's still master of fate and his army. Rather than simply returning by the route they came, he decides to explore new territories, to campaign down the Indus River system, conquering every tribe and city they encounter. It's completely unnecessary from a strategic standpoint and dangerous given the army's condition. But Alexander cannot simply retreat. He must conquer something, must prove that the decision to turn back was strategic choice rather than forced limitation. The army descends the Indus River on a fleet of boats built for the purpose, with forces marching on both banks. Alexander attacks cities that offer no threat, fights battles that achieve nothing except casualties, and takes risks that seem increasingly reckless. At the city of the Mali, Alexander's recklessness nearly kills him. During the assault on the city walls, Alexander is first over the ramparts, accompanied by only 3 companions. The ladder breaks, stranding Alexander inside the walls with thousands of enemy soldiers. Rather than waiting for more ladders or for a gate to be opened, rather than showing any caution whatsoever, Alexander jumps down into the city and fights surrounded by enemies, his back to the wall, literally. An arrow pierces his breastplate and lodges in his lung. He collapses, and the 3 companions who jumped in with him fight desperately to protect his body. Finally, the Macedonians break through the walls and pour into the city, slaughtering every living thing in a frenzy of rage and fear at nearly losing their king. Alexander is carried from the city more dead than alive, the arrow still embedded in his chest. The extraction of the arrow is excruciating and nearly kills him. When news spreads through the army that Alexander has been gravely wounded, possibly dead, the soldiers panic. Despite their exhaustion and frustration, despite forcing him to turn back from the Hydaspes, they cannot imagine continuing without him. When Alexander recovers enough to be moved, he makes a point of appearing before the army, raising his arm to show he's alive, riding his horse, though the effort nearly causes him to collapse. The soldiers weep with relief and surge forward to touch him, to throw flowers, to reassure themselves that he's really alive. It is a moment that demonstrates the impossible contradictions of Alexander. They love him even as they fear him, They'll follow him anywhere except where he wants them to go. They rebound to him by chains of shared experience and loyalty, even as they resent his endless ambition. By early 325 BCE, the army reaches the mouth of the Indus River and the Indian Ocean. Alexander, ever curious, sends his admiral Nearchus with the fleet to explore the ocean route from India to the Persian Gulf, to prove that it can be done and to chart the coastline. The rest of the army will return by land, divided into two groups. One column, under Craterus, will take the northern route through Arachosia. Alexander himself will lead the other column through the Gedrosian Desert, roughly corresponding to modern southern Pakistan and Iran. It's reportedly the route that the legendary Assyrian queen Semiramis took with her army, and it's said that she lost all but 20 of her soldiers to the desert. Alexander, characteristically, sees this as a challenge. If Semiramis failed, then succeeding where she failed will add to his legend. He's about to lead his army into the worst disaster of his career, one entirely of his own making. The story of how Alexander the Great conquered the known world is ultimately a story about the heights human ambition can reach and the price such ambition demands. It begins with a 20-year-old prince standing over his murdered father's body, and ends with a 32-year-old king god dying in a Babylonian palace, his vast empire already crumbling. In the 13 years between these two moments, Alexander achieves what no human before or since has accomplished: the conquest of the entire known world. From the Adriatic to the Indus, from the Danube to the Nile. How did he do it? The answer is complex, but can be understood through several key factors. First, Alexander inherited perhaps the finest army in the ancient world from his father Philip, a professional, well-trained, tactically innovative force built around the Macedonian phalanx and companion cavalry. Second, Alexander was himself a military genius with an instinctive grasp of tactics and strategy, capable of adapting to any enemy or terrain. From the cavalry charges of Granicus and Issus to the siege warfare of Tyre, from the set-piece battle of Gaugamela to the mountain warfare of Central Asia. Third, Alexander possessed extraordinary personal courage and charisma, leading from the front, sharing his soldiers' dangers, inspiring them to achieve what they thought impossible. Fourth, he showed political intelligence in presenting himself as a liberator to Greeks in Asia Minor and as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne after Darius' death, making his conquests more than mere military occupation. But these factors alone cannot fully explain Alexander's success. We must also account for the weakness and divisions of his enemies. The Persian Empire in 334 BCE was vast but fragile, a multi-ethnic state held together by force and bureaucracy, but lacking the national cohesion that might have enabled sustained resistance. Darius III was a weak king who twice fled from battle, destroying his own credibility. The Persian strategy of relying on Greek mercenaries created inherent contradictions and limited effectiveness. In India, the lack of political unity meant Alexander faced kingdoms one at a time rather than a coordinated resistance. Alexander's genius lay partly in recognizing and exploiting these weaknesses, in moving so quickly that enemies couldn't unite against him, in using propaganda and terror to break enemy morale before battles were even fought. Yet we cannot understand Alexander's conquests without also understanding their costs. Hundreds of thousands died in his wars: Persian soldiers at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, Tyrian defenders and civilians, Indian warriors at the Hydaspes, Greek mercenaries who fought on the wrong side, and his own soldiers, whether killed in battle or lost in the Gedrosian Desert. Entire cities were destroyed, their populations killed or enslaved. Cultures were disrupted, kingdoms overthrown, dynasties eliminated. The suffering Alexander caused in pursuit of glory is incalculable. And in the end, his empire died with him, fragmenting immediately into warring kingdoms that would fight over his legacy for generations. What remains is the legend and the legacy. The legend of Alexander has inspired conquerors, kings, and dreamers for more than 2 millennia. Julius Caesar wept when he read about Alexander's achievements at age 32, feeling he had accomplished nothing by comparison. Napoleon studied Alexander's campaigns and saw himself as a modern Alexander. Countless others have invoked his name, sought to emulate his deeds, imagined themselves as the new Alexander. The legend transcends the man, becomes something mythical, a symbol of human potential unbound by convention or limitation. The legacy is more complex and enduring. Alexander's conquests spread Greek culture, language, and learning across 3 continents, creating the Hellenistic world that would shape Western civilization for centuries. The cities he founded became centers of culture and commerce. The mixing of Greek and Eastern cultures he encouraged, however imperfectly, created new syntheses in art, philosophy, science, and religion. His demonstration that Persians and Greeks could work together within a single system, even if that system didn't survive him, planted ideas about universal empire and cultural exchange that would influence Roman emperors and Islamic caliphs. His military innovations influenced warfare for centuries. His example of the heroic individual who reshapes history through will and ability became a template for understanding historical change itself. But we must also reckon with the darkness. Alexander's increasing megalomania, his demand for worship, his paranoid violence against his friends, his reckless disregard for his soldiers' lives, all reveal the corrupting influence of absolute power. His treatment of defeated cities like Thebes and Tyre demonstrates the brutality that often accompanies conquest. However, it may be dressed up in propaganda about liberation or destiny. His murder of Cletus in a drunken rage, his execution of Callisthenes for philosophical opposition, his near-death experience at the siege of the Mali caused by his own recklessness. These moments reveal a man increasingly unmoored from reality, unable to accept limits, believing himself beyond ordinary human constraints. In the end, Alexander conquered the known world through a combination of military genius, inherited advantages, personal charisma, political intelligence, enemy weakness, and sheer indomitable will. But the conquest cost him his humanity, his relationships, ultimately his life. He died having conquered everything except himself, having pushed his army to the edge of the world, but lost their affection in the process, having made himself a god in his own imagination, but dying as humans do, of fever and possibly poison, alone except for courtiers who immediately began fighting over his corpse. The young king who set out to avenge Greece and defeat Persia ended as something stranger and more troubling. A god king who belonged to no culture, a conqueror with no home, an empire builder who left only ruins. Yet despite everything, the achievement remained staggering. In an age when most people never traveled 50 miles from their birthplace, Alexander marched an army 20,000 miles. In a world of limited horizons, he expanded the boundaries of the possible. In an era of small city-states and tribal kingdoms, he created an empire that spanned continents. He proved that the known world was not the limit of the world, that cultural boundaries could be crossed, that nothing was truly impossible to those with sufficient courage and will. For better and worse, Alexander changed history, reshaped cultures, influenced civilizations for thousands of years. However we judge his character or his choices, we cannot deny that he conquered the known world. The question that haunts his story is whether the world, once conquered, was worth the conquering, and whether the conqueror, having gained everything, lost something essential in the process. These questions, like Alexander's legend, remain with us still, as relevant today as they were when he drew his last breath in Babylon over 2,000 years ago.